Jordan Mercer was asked to leave his first-class seat barely 3 minutes after placing his bag down, surrounded by the irritated glare of an older passenger and the cold, calculated smile of the chief flight attendant. No one in the cabin knew that this decision, a decision that seemed so natural and unquestionable, was about to drag the entire airline into a storm they could never have anticipated. Jordan looked up, his eyes calm like a dark, still lake. But deep within, something subtle flickered. He sensed exactly what was happening. Not a mix-up, not a system glitch, but prejudice, dressed in a professional uniform. Beside him, Chuck Davenport, 58 years old, his face flushed red above a wrinkled tweed suit, trembled with indignation, as if his rightful throne had been stolen. Jordan said nothing, no reaction, only observation, because he understood that sometimes silence weighs more than any justification. Karen Whitfield, the chief flight attendant, approached. Her face was so heavily made up, it seemed almost expressionless. "Sir, I need you to step out of this seat," she said, her voice smooth, polite, and completely lifeless. The air in the first-class cabin tightened, as if squeezed by an invisible hand. Jordan Mercer, 41, was not the type who flaunted status. He wore a grey athleisure outfit, tailored with such precision it felt weightless, elegant as cold metal, refined enough to be tasteful, not showy enough to declare status. Some people looked at him and thought, athleisure in first class, maybe he got a lucky upgrade. No one imagined he was the CEO of Meridian Dynamics, the logistics AI giant that controlled nearly 30% of all autonomous cargo routes in North America, a man who had negotiated deals that made the global transport industry bow their heads. Yet in this moment, all they saw was a black man who looked younger than the usual occupants of Seat 1A. That misjudgment was something Jordan had lived with his entire life, but an airplane cabin was the place he least expected it to unfold. Karen glanced at his boarding pass, the way someone might skim a cheap flyer. Maybe the app glitched, she murmured, not bothering to hide her doubt. She turned to Chuck with a voice that softened by a noticeable degree. "Mr. Davenport, please don't worry. We'll sort this out." Chuck let out a victorious grunt. "I've flown this route for 20 years. This seat has always been mine." Jordan closed his magazine. "Seat 1A was booked by me 6 months ago." He said, his tone so gentle it irritated Karen, because it left her no foothold to push back. "Please check the system again." Karen's brow lifted. She was not used to being challenged, so she replied, the word "sir" escaping her lips like reluctant charity. "In cases of seating conflicts, we prioritize Platinum Elite members." A line invented on the spot. A policy that did not exist. An insult wrapped in the language of procedure. Jordan did not get angry. His face did not tighten. He did not behave in any of the ways they expected him to. He looked at Karen with the analytical calm of someone reviewing flawed data. "I'd like you to verify the manifest with the operations center," he said softly. "It won't take much time." Karen's lips pressed together with irritation, as if he had just challenged her authority. Chuck jumped in, eager to maintain his imagined victory. "Buddy, don't waste everyone's time. I have a major signing in London. Let's keep things moving." Jordan looked at Chuck for exactly 1 second, just one, and in that brief moment, there was something in his gaze that would have made a perceptive man shiver. But Chuck, too, inflated with entitlement to recognize danger, noticed nothing. The captain stepped out. Richard Hayes, 56, his face worn from decades of flying, wanted only one thing to take off without complications. And in his mind, that meant asking Jordan to yield. "We have a seating issue," he said, trying to sound composed. "To avoid delays, please move to seat 3D. We will compensate you afterward." No one asked Jordan how he felt. No one asked who was right or who was wrong. They simply wanted him removed from seat 1A, underestimation, assumption, and complete confidence that he would quietly comply. Jordan nodded. He zipped his bag, stood, and stepped aside. But inside him, a precise plan was beginning to form, activated not by anger, but by strategy. As he passed, Chuck, the entitled man, flashed a triumphant smile. "Good chap," Chuck said, patting the armrest. "Keeping the order is always best." Jordan did not respond, but something in his silence made a faint ripple of unease pass through Karen. Jordan sat down in seat 3D. He set his magazine aside and unlocked his phone. Not to complain, not to rant on social media, but to activate a power they had no idea existed. One message, one email, one confirmed signature, all within 5 minutes. And as the plane hummed, ready to taxi, Jordan pressed send on an email the press would later call the 5-minute email that broke an airline. The moment Jordan pressed send, a strange stillness rippled around him. Not the quiet of the sky, but the quiet of a powerful machine coming to life. Beneath the soft hum of the engines and the cool, conditioned air, it felt as if an invisible current was running through the aircraft cabin from the modest seat 3D all the way to the highest floor of an airline empire worth tens of billions of dollars. He set his phone down on the tray table, leaned back and reopened his magazine. To anyone watching, he looked like a calm passenger passing time. But inside, he knew exactly what those 5 minutes would do. They would rearrange the entire architecture of Aurora Airlines. And the people who had underestimated him had no idea the storm already on its way. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes had no clue that everything had just shifted. He was moments away from announcing takeoff when his comm screen lit up with a tone that every veteran pilot recognized an executive priority call. The only thing more alarming than the tone was the name displayed: Andrew Collins, Chief Executive Officer, Aurora Airlines. Richard felt his chest tighten. No pilot wanted a direct call from the CEO as the plane prepared to taxi. "What now?" he muttered, then pressed accept. Captain Hayes speaking. The voice on the other end was not loud, yet it was heavy with authority, sharp and cold like metal forged in fire. "Richard, this is Andrew Collins. I will be direct." A 1-second pause, the kind that precedes a fatal strike. What on earth is happening in your first-class cabin? Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "Sir, I am not sure what you are referring to." The CEO's voice snapped like a whip, the kind of anger so tightly contained it seemed to vibrate the air. "Do not pretend you do not know. I just received an email from Jordan Mercer." Richard's heart lurched. The name familiar, but he could not place it fast enough. The CEO continued. "The man you removed from seat 1A, the man now sitting in 3D, the man you and your chief attendant just treated like garbage." Richard swallowed hard, sweat forming at his temple. "Sir, it was simply a seat duplication. We were preparing for takeoff. So a duplication." Collins thundered, though still controlled enough not to shout. "Are you aware that Meridian Dynamics is preparing to inject $4.2 billion into Aurora's systems? Do you know who Jordan Mercer is?" Richard's throat tightened. He is a first-class passenger," Collins said, or slowly each word dropping like the edge of a blade, is the man who just restructured our entire financial plan for the year. He is our most critical strategic partner. Without him, we shut down 18 routes. And now he has written a heavy silence to terminate all contracts. Every one of them. The cockpit suddenly felt too small, suffocating. Andrew Collins spoke again, his voice like iron dragged over stone. You have two options. One, return to the gate immediately. Two, write your resignation letter from the cockpit. Richard exhaled shakily. We will return to the gate. And when you do, Collins said colder than before, you will personally go to first class and apologize to Mr. Mercer, not for the seat, but for the stain you just put on this airline's dignity. The call ended with a sharp click. Richard Hayes sat frozen for 3 seconds. Then he turned to his first officer, pale as chalk. We are going back. His voice was barely more than a whisper. In the passenger cabin, Chuck Davenport was still reveling in his victory legs, stretched out champagne in hand, the glass delivered by Karen just moments earlier. Finally back in proper order, Chuck said to her, half amused, half triumphant, "For the price I pay, 1A is naturally mine." Karen smiled to please him, but a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. The captain had been gone from the cockpit door longer than usual, and the aircraft was beginning to throttle down. Jordan lowered his magazine, not even needing to look. The plane was turning off the runway. Not a technical fault, not a security check. This was the result of the past 5 minutes. Karen, wide-eyed, rushed off to confirm. She returned moments later, her face drained of color. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, trying to steady her voice, "the aircraft will be returning to the gate due to a passenger issue." Chuck burst into laughter. "Excellent! Maybe they will drag that guy in the sportswear out of here." A few passengers stared at Jordan with suspicion. Some assumed he had caused a disturbance. But he sat still, composed, fluid calm. And that calm unnerved people more than anger ever could. When the plane stopped at the gate and the door opened, it was not ground staff who stepped in. It was Mark Reynolds, the station manager, someone Karen had only heard about, never actually seen on board. Behind him was Captain Richard Hayes, looking as if his soul had been drained. Before Karen could piece anything together, Mark Reynolds walked straight to seat 3D. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice low and filled with unmistakable respect, the kind Karen had never heard used for any passenger. "On behalf of Aurora Airlines, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience you experienced." Karen froze, eyes widening at the word, "Sir." What is happening?" she whispered. But no one answered. Captain Hayes swallowed hard and stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer, I misjudged the situation. I take full responsibility." Chuck heard it, confused, lifting his head. Mercer, who he is. Just the captain cut him off, his voice dry as sand. "You're speaking to Jordan Mercer, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Dynamics." Chuck went rigid as if slapped across the face. A cold shiver ripped through Karen's spine. That name, she had heard it in training briefings. A key figure in Aurora's post-pandemic recovery strategy. Someone management said must be treated with absolute priority if he ever flew with the airline. And she not only failed to prioritize him, she had humiliated him in front of other passengers. Jordan looked at them with a serene, unreadable expression, saying nothing. But that silence felt like a vice, tightening around the entire cabin. At that moment, Dr. Melissa Grant, who had recorded everything, glanced from Jordan to Karen. Her eyes held the polite fury of an academic, witnessing injustice sharp as a scalpel. Karen realized instantly she had filmed it all, which meant the truth was now permanent. Captain Hayes drew a long breath. "Mr. Mercer, if you prefer to return to seat 1A, Jordan raised a hand, cutting him off. "I will stay in 3D. Richard froze. "But sir, I want to sit exactly where you believed I belonged." Jordan replied, his voice gentle, but edged like shattered glass. "From here to London, I will stay in 3D. Seat 1A, leave it for Mr. Davenport." Chuck felt the air sucked out of his lungs. Karen stood still, lips trembling. Jordan looked at the captain one last time. "This is not about a seat. I am observing how an organization treats the people it assumes are unimportant. And today, Aurora made that very clear. Each word fell like a hammer against steel." The captain bowed his head. Mark Reynolds bowed his head. Karen nearly collapsed from the weight of it. Jordan reopened his magazine, signaling that the conversation was over. But for everyone else, the nightmare had only begun. 7 minutes later, as the plane prepared to restart, Karen slipped into the rear galley, pressing her back against the cool metal of the storage unit. Her hands trembled, nails tapping softly against the cabinet in a nervous rhythm. She tried to swallow her panic, but it rose higher each second like a tidal wave. She had made a mistake. Not a small one. A catastrophic one. Chuck sat in seat 1A, like a statue, feeling the luxurious leather beneath him turn cold as stone. Dr. Melissa Grant smiled faintly, the smile of someone aware she had just witnessed history. Captain Richard Hayes felt each passing minute slice into his 25-year career like a blade. And Jordan, he remained composed, as if everything was unfolding at precisely the pace he intended. The outside world did not yet know what had happened, but the moment this plane took off again, everything would change forever. As the engines roared back to life, the gentle lighting of the first-class cabin seemed to shift. It was no longer the warm, golden glow designed for comfort, but a colder, harsher brightness, as if it meant to expose everything hidden beneath the chaos of the past few minutes. Jordan Mercer returned to the magazine in his hands, though his eyes were not reading. They remained still, staring into nothing, as if he were observing even the smallest movements in the space around him. They appeared distant, yet nothing escaped their awareness. He was not the type to erupt in anger. He was the type who observed, who allowed the entire system to reveal its own cracks. And that system was starting to fracture. Only the perceptive could see it. At the front of the cabin, Chuck Davenport cleared his throat repeatedly, as if trying to project an authority he no longer felt inside. Every time his hand reached up to adjust his tie, a ripple of anxiety spread deeper through his chest. This will all be explained when we get to London," Chuck muttered, though it sounded more like he was speaking to himself than anyone else. He glanced at Jordan in seat 3D. Jordan did not look back. That silence to Chuck was more terrifying than any argument. It made him feel as though he had done something irreversible. Karen Whitfield stood in the galley like someone who had lost all sense of direction. Her fingers dug into the cold metal edge of the cabinet. She wanted to do something, anything. Pour water, arrange hot towels, check the cabin. Anything to escape the feeling that she was exposed under the scrutiny of the entire world. But she did not dare step out. Her breath tightened as the thoughts rushed in. What if the CEO asked about the anti-bias training she had skimmed through? What if he questioned why she had ignored complaints from passengers of color for 5 years? What if he posted everything online? Every what if sliced through her defenses like a blade. Captain Richard Hayes returned to the cockpit, gathering himself. He said nothing for 5 minutes, staring at the control panel though his hands trembled. 25 years in the sky, he whispered. All just to end like this. The first officer looked at him with sympathy, but there was nothing he could do. He knew as well as Richard, when the CEO intervened personally, the situation was already beyond repair. "Shall we take off, Captain?" "Take off." Richard replied, his voice stripped of weight. But he knew that once the plane touched down in London, taking off would no longer be part of his life. As the aircraft lifted into the air, Jordan leaned back again. The moment most people enjoyed the rush of the engines, the pull of gravity. The sudden lightness meant nothing more to him than the ticking of a countdown. Not a countdown to London. A countdown to the collapse of an entire system built on prejudice and false authority. About 20 minutes after the plane stabilized, a younger flight attendant named Rachel approached Jordan. She looked nervous, though, trying hard to be professional. "Mr. Mercer, may we offer you?" Jordan smiled softly. "I am fine. Thank you." The softness of that smile surprised her. No one would have guessed that the gentle expression belonged to the man whose email had forced the airline's CEO out of bed in the middle of the night. She bowed slightly and walked away, exhaling in relief. From a distance, Karen saw the interaction, her heartbeat pounding. She knew Jordan was not cruel, not loud, not the type to insult or berate. But it was precisely his calmness that frightened her most. People who stayed calm were the ones with real power, and real power never needed to raise its voice. First class fell into an uncanny silence. The sound of pages turning, the faint clinks of glasses, the soft tapping of keyboards all seemed quieter than usual. Everyone sensed that the atmosphere had changed. Even Chuck, normally boastful and chatty, stayed perfectly silent. He stole another glance at Jordan, desperately searching for a way to justify himself, to excuse what had happened. But when Jordan met his gaze for half a second, Chuck felt as if someone had looked straight through him, past the decades of pride, past the polished exterior, and straight into the empty space behind it. He turned away immediately. In seat 2, Dr. Melissa Grant, the woman who had recorded the video, watched Jordan with a mix of curiosity and respect. She had witnessed political and social upheavals across 40 years of teaching, but rarely had she seen a single individual, through absolute composure, alone force an entire system to tremble. She thought to herself, this man is not just addressing injustice against himself, he is about to create a fracture in aviation culture. She opened her camera app, rewatched the footage, and knew it would spread. Not because of rage, but because of truth. Meanwhile, Karen stood in the galley, fingers fidgeting with a folded towel. She wanted to approach Jordan, wanted to apologize, wanted to salvage whatever dignity she had left, wanted to explain that she didn't mean it. But every step toward him felt like chains tightening around her legs. She feared that if she got too close, one look into his eyes would tell her everything she did not want to admit there was nothing left to fix. She feared that one sentence from him would be enough to end her 20-year career. She feared most of all that Jordan could send a second email. The thought made her shiver. A soft ding filled the cabin, the chime for beverage service. Rachel stepped out, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. Would you prefer champagne or still water? Jordan sat upright and answered politely. Water, thank you. Chuck waved dismissively. Bring me the best champagne you have left. I deserve something after all that. Rachel stiffened slightly. She avoided looking at Jordan. Chuck's arrogance was a flashing sign to her. A man accustomed to privilege. A man who could not comprehend the consequences headed his way. Jordan remained silent. His silence was not surrender. It was anticipation. Nearly 2 hours later, Captain Hayes slipped out of the cockpit to use the restroom. He knew he could not avoid passing through first class forever. And the moment he stepped out, every pair of eyes landed on him as if under a spotlight. Not anger, not outrage, but quiet observation, the kind people reserve for evaluating how a leader handles the aftermath of his own actions. He avoided looking at seat 3D, which only made everyone stare harder. He walked quickly, almost running, disappearing behind the curtain. Jordan leaned his head back, eyes half closed, though his mind stayed sharp. He remembered something his mother once told him during a long bus ride through Chicago when he was still a child. You do not need to shout to prove you are right. You just need to let them see they are wrong. Today, he was living that lesson, and it had never been more effective. When the plane reached halfway through the route, Karen was forced to come out and serve because her supervisor called. She stood at the front of the cabin, trying to steady her voice, trying not to tremble. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, though, her voice cracked. We apologize for the inconvenience earlier in the flight. Chuck looked up as if the apology were a gift meant for him. Well, good. I shouldn't have had to deal with that mess. Karen closed her eyes for a moment and opened them again. But her gaze shifted toward Jordan without meaning to. He looked at her, not sternly, not frowning, not punishing, just looking. But that look made her gasp quietly, as if he was seeing through her into the deeper reasons she had become the person she was today, tired, prideful, skeptical, and carrying biases she told herself were normal. She turned away quickly. Time passed. Jordan opened his laptop. Not to write another email, he did not need to do anything else. He reviewed the analysis of Aurora Airlines' infrastructure, included in the $4.2 billion investment plan. And he knew what Karen and Richard had done was not a personal error. It was a symptom of a systemic disease. Discrimination, misplaced authority, a culture that rewarded noise instead of integrity. Aurora Airlines needed to be rebuilt from the foundation. And if Andrew Collins was smart, he would collaborate with Jordan to make that restructuring happen. If not, Aurora would collapse. Jordan did not need to threaten him. Collins already knew. About 3 hours after takeoff, Jordan received a message through the in-flight network. I am en route to Heathrow. A private car will be waiting for you at the VIP entrance, Andrew Collins. Jordan allowed a small, serene smile to form. Karen saw that smile from afar, and she knew, in that moment, that whatever chance she had to redeem herself was gone. When the cabin lights came on, signaling preparation for landing, everyone in first class felt the same thing once the wheels touched the ground in London. What awaited them was not just the next destination. It was judgment. Chuck swallowed repeatedly. He thought about his reputation, his long-time clients, the consulting contracts, the conferences where he had flaunted his elite membership like a trophy. He knew that if even one person at Aurora whispered what had happened, his entire network could crumble. Karen imagined Andrew Collins looking directly at her and asking one simple question. Why did you do it? She had no answer. Captain Richard Hayes sat with his hands resting on his knees, knowing his future was no longer his own. And Jordan looked out the window, the lights of London reflecting across the glass like 1,000 stars scattering downward. No one realizes, he thought, how a single moment of disrespect can destroy an empire. And for Aurora Airlines, that moment had arrived. When the plane touched down first class, held its breath. "Please remain seated," the announcement echoed. "The door will open, but we ask that all passengers wait for further instructions." That was not a normal announcement, and everyone knew it. Jordan fastened his seatbelt again and breathed steadily. The confrontation was coming. One airline, one rotting culture, one underestimated man, and the moment of truth ready to tear apart everything they thought they knew. The moment the massive Boeing 787 lifted off the ground, the atmosphere in the business class cabin shifted instantly. The half-hearted laughter of passengers faded, leaving a suspended silence drifting between the rows of seats. No one said a word, but everyone knew something unusual was unfolding. Jonathan Hale, the man who had been stripped of seat 2, by the very crew whose system he was preparing to invest billions of dollars into, sat quietly in seat 5. D opened his laptop and typed the final lines of the email that had already turned the entire flight upside down. Jonathan did not look at anyone, nor did he show a hint of insult or anger. He simply remained silent, as if he were rewriting the world with a few keystrokes. But inside him, a cold storm unfurled, not a storm of rage, but one of disappointment. He had grown used to being judged by appearances, but this time it struck at what he despised most, the arrogance of those who believed they held power. 3 rows ahead, Wendy Clark, the attendant who had used her supposed authority to remove him from his seat, was pouring champagne for the passenger she believed was the real VIP. Her attempt at staying composed no longer hid the fear tightening around her throat. She knew she had made a mistake. What terrified her more was the sinking realization that it was a mistake beyond repair. In the cockpit, Captain Ross Riley stared straight ahead, but his mind was nowhere near the flight path. When he received the satellite call from the CEO of Airverse Airlines, his hands went numb. 1 second earlier, he had been the commander of a $280 million aircraft. 1 second later, he was just a fool who had pushed the airline to the edge of catastrophe. "Who is he?" Ross asked for. The third time, his voice strained. From his headset, CEO Ken Marshall no longer sounded like a leader. He sounded like a furious deity. "You just removed the man we are signing a $6.4 billion partnership with, the man who is saving the financial life of this airline. I warned you never mishandle a VIP from Ethereum Logistics. And you just committed the most idiotic mistake possible." Ross swallowed hard. He felt his 27-year career dissolving into smoke. In the business class cabin, Jonathan continued reviewing documents, but with every passing minute, the crew grew more restless. They whispered anxiously in the galley, glancing toward him, as if he were a bomb waiting to detonate. The junior attendant, Emily Foster, who had stood silently while Wendy pushed Jonathan out of his rightful seat, felt her chest tighten. Wendy's earlier words stabbed at her mind like needles. "He doesn't look like business class. This seat is for real frequent flyers. We have a priority policy, a policy Wendy invented." Emily was not a bad person, but her silence had helped shove an innocent man out of the seat he rightfully purchased. Now she began to understand there was something unusual about Jonathan, not in the way Wendy thought. Not undeserving, but far too powerful. 37 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft banked left slightly, then unexpectedly descended. Passengers looked around anxiously as the seatbelt sign illuminated, even though there was no turbulence. Wendy immediately bent down toward the nearest passengers, her voice trembling. Just a small adjustment. But when the cockpit door opened, her reassurance collapsed instantly. Captain Ross stepped out, pale as ash, his body shaking, as though he had narrowly survived a disaster. He walked straight to row 5, straight to Jonathan, and stopped as if his feet had been nailed to the floor. "Mr. Hale." The entire business class cabin froze. Wendy stood behind him, eyes wide. Jonathan lifted his gaze from his laptop. Ross swallowed hard, then bowed deeply, his voice hoarse. "We apologize for what happened earlier. We would like to invite you back to seat 2A. Jonathan looked at him for several seconds, his expression calm enough to chill the air. "That is unnecessary," he said softly. "I am comfortable here." A gentle sentence, yet as merciless as a sentence passed by a judge. Ross was paralyzed. Wendy could barely breathe. The flight service manager stepped forward, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. "Mr. Hale, we are extremely sorry. This was a serious misunderstanding." "Be earlier?" Jonathan interrupted. "You said seat 2. A belonged to someone more deserving. I am simply respecting your original assessment." Wendy felt her heart drop to the floor, too. Ross looked as though he might collapse to his knees. When the plane changed course, turning back toward New York instead of continuing to London, the passengers exchanged nervous whispers. But Wendy knew the truth. She knew her life had ended the moment Jonathan pressed send. In business class, Jonathan opened his laptop again, not to threaten, not to retaliate, simply to document the final events of a situation he had barely touched, yet one that had already destroyed the careers of those who underestimated him. Emily approached from behind, hands, trembling lips drained of color. "Sir, I am sorry. I should not have stayed silent." Jonathan looked at her. His eyes were not cold, but sorrowful. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" he asked. Emily shook her head, trembling. "Not Wendy," he said quietly. "The worst part is the silence of the people who knew she was wrong." Emily burst into tears. When the plane landed, senior security officers, the regional director of Airverse, and 2 legal representatives waited by the jet bridge. Passengers looked at them, then at Jonathan, and finally understood that the man they had dismissed was the very person the entire airline now stood trembling to greet. Wendy exited first. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking. The regional manager spoke coldly. "Wendy Clark, Emily Foster, Captain Ross Riley. You are all placed under immediate suspension. Please surrender your badges and uniforms." The business class cabin fell silent. Jonathan stepped off the aircraft without looking back. He did not need to. The system corrected itself when the person guiding it did not need to shout or rage, only needed to choose the right moment to withdraw his hand. Outside, the wind swept past the line of waiting aircraft. Jonathan entered the car sent personally by the CEO of Airverse. He exhaled slowly. Not out of victory, out of exhaustion. He was not seeking power. He simply wanted to be treated with dignity. And sometimes, one email was enough to remind the world never underestimate someone you do not understand. The sleek black car slipped off the runway, with a soft hiss of its tires, leaving behind the golden glow of the airport lights, reflecting off the tinted windows. Jonathan Hale sat quietly in the back seat, his hands woven together, his eyes fixed on the view outside. The distant city, shining like a halo of lights, did nothing to distract him. His mind lingered on the moment Wendy lowered her head, her trembling fingers unfastening the badge from her uniform. He felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. Streetlights slid past like a stream of memories. He remembered his father's words, "Real power is not in punishing those who are wrong. It is in showing the world why that wrong can never be allowed to happen again." Jonathan wondered whether he had used his influence to teach a needed lesson, or whether he had unintentionally sparked a storm that he no longer fully controlled. Meanwhile, back at the airport, that storm was spreading like wildfire. In Airverse's emergency meeting room, 11 minutes after the aircraft touched down, Regional Director Martin Price slammed a stack of reports onto the table. "Ken, you need to handle this yourself. The video leaked, I do not know from where, but it is already on Twitter, and the views are rising every second." CEO Ken Marshall closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I know," he whispered. "Mr. Hale sent another email after he left the plane." Martin blinked. "Sent to whom?" "To me." The room fell utterly silent. Martin exhaled. "And what did he say?" Ken lowered his voice. "He did not ask for compensation. He did not ask for terminations. He did not ask for an internal investigation. He did not demand anything at all. He sent one sentence, 'Let me see how you handle this.' The room was packed, yet everyone felt the temperature drop. One sentence, one period, one crushing silence. For Jonathan Hale, it was merely a reminder. For Airverse, it was an ultimatum. In the car, Jonathan received a call from an unknown number. He answered without change in expression. "Mr. Hale," a deep, polite voice said. "This is Lionel Rhodes, chairman of the Securities Commission. We may need to discuss certain matters regarding Airverse." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. He had not expected this. "Reason?" he asked. "The video is spreading rapidly. There are signs that Airverse has concealed complaints related to discriminatory treatment. Their communications department has gone completely silent. This may impact the stock." Jonathan paused. He understood how large systems worked. One incident, one piece of evidence, one video, and the entire structure shook, turning every eye toward the person with the most leverage. And right now that person was him. Not because he sought the role, but because Airverse had placed that power in his hands when they misjudged him. "I understand," Jonathan said, "but I do not want to increase public pressure on them. My goal is to fix, not destroy." Mr. Hale Lionel said quietly, "You are too kind, but this system is not built for kind people. If you do nothing, Airverse shares will fall more than 20% by morning." Jonathan pressed his lips together. Ken Marshall needed to make a decision. But Jonathan also knew that if he let the old system run unchecked, it would crush anyone in its path, including the innocent. He didn't want Wendy to lose her job. He didn't want Emily to face public outrage. He didn't want Ross to lose his pension. But the truth was coming at them like a train without brakes, and he could not step off the tracks. At the airport, Wendy Clark sat alone in the staff lounge, her folded uniform on the table. Her white blouse still held the faint scent of inexpensive perfume she used to mask the fatigue of a long day. Wendy had worked 22 years and never imagined everything could end so suddenly. She stared at the mirror. The woman looking back had tired eyes and a hint of bitterness. She wondered, have I always been this way, or did this job turn me into someone like this? Once she had been a warm, enthusiastic attendant who wanted every passenger to feel cared for. But years of metrics, complaints, entitlement from wealthy travelers Performance reviews and pressure had worn her down. She thought toughness was armor. She never realized it had become a trap that made her harsh. She slammed her hand on the table, regret rising so fast it choked her. How could I treat him like that? She whispered, voice breaking. Her heart, used to hiding behind pride, now felt painfully exposed. The door burst open. Emily stepped in, eyes swollen, her hands still trembling. They said the video is online, Emily choked out. Wendy looked up. Mr. Hale, he could ruin our entire careers. Emily shook her head, tears streaming. He is not that kind of man. You saw him. He just wanted to be respected. Wendy closed her eyes, her heart tightening. She knew Emily was right. Jonathan was not the one destroying them. They had pushed themselves to the edge. At Airverse headquarters, CEO Marshall stood before a mirror. He straightened his tie and stared at his own reflection, the face of a man about to make decisions in one night that could change the company's history. He remembered a meeting 3 months earlier, when Jonathan first walked into his office. No secretary, no negotiation team, no display of wealth. Just one sentence: Airverse can do better, and I am willing to invest so it can. That was the first time Marshall believed the aviation industry, slow and resistant to change, could evolve. And now he stood at the moment that would prove it. He turned, striking the desk with a firm tap. "Prepare a press conference," Marshall told his assistant, "and take me to Mr. Hale's hotel." The assistant froze. "Right now, sir. Right now." His voice carried the resolve of someone with no path backward. At a luxury hotel in Manhattan, Jonathan checked into his room, set his briefcase on the table, removed his watch, and let warm water run over his hands. But each passing second brought his mind back to Wendy, trembling, Emily crying, Ross bowing his head. He did not want their lives destroyed, but he could not allow a culture of arrogance to continue. He stood on the thin line between power and compassion. He did not want to tear down a system. He wanted to rebuild it. A knock sounded at the door. Jonathan opened it. CEO Ken Marshall stood there, breathing hard like someone who had rushed from the elevator. Their eyes met. In Jonathan's calm, in Marshall's determination. Mr. Hale, Marshall said, bowing deeply, "I am here to make this right." Jonathan studied him for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "We have much to do." It was not the tone of an offended man. It was the voice of someone preparing to reset the order of an entire industry. And that night, the two men on opposite sides of the storm sat across from each other, in a room overlooking the glowing city, ready to redraw the map of aviation with the calm resilience of a man once underestimated and the resolve of a man who realized his mistake. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, not a chapter of revenge, but one of responsibility, transformation, and justice. Rain drifted softly over New York, the tiny droplets sliding down the tall glass window of the 38th floor, like thousands of silent punctuation marks closing a day that had ended in chaos. In the dim golden light of the hotel room, Jonathan Hale and Ken Marshall sat across from each other at a walnut table. The faint scent of mint tea floated in the air, but neither man had the mind to enjoy it. The silence stretched on heavy and unsettling, not because they lacked words, but because they understood that whatever would be spoken next could reshape the future of an entire airline. Jonathan set his cup down and tapped a finger lightly on the handle, as if marking the rhythm of a song he had heard too many times in his life, the song of being underestimated. Ken Marshall, his face drawn with exhaustion, and his eyes reddened by stress, wanted to speak, but could not find a place to begin. He had never faced the edge of losing control the way he had tonight. In the end, it was Jonathan who broke the silence. He rose, walked to the window and looked down at the city slowly sinking into darkness. The scattered lights reflecting against the glass cast his silhouette like a lone figure, surrounded by waves of shifting illumination. "Do you know what disappointed me most?" Ken Jonathan asked, his voice soft but cold. It was not that Wendy dismissed me. It was not that Ross tried to force me out of my seat. What disappointed me was the silence of the organization you lead. Silence in the face of wrongdoing. Silence in the face of injustice. Silence toward what should have been corrected. Ken lowered his head. "I know we failed." Jonathan turned back toward him. "No, you do not know. If you knew, today would not have happened." His words carried no anger, no accusation. They felt instead like an unavoidable truth marking the line between two men, one holding financial power, the other holding the fate of a collapsing system. Ken inhaled deeply and looked Jonathan directly in the eye as though accepting a verdict. "Then help me understand. From this moment on." Jonathan remained still for a moment, then returned to the table and opened his laptop. When the screen lit up, rows of data appeared like thousands of cuts, revealing Airverse's hidden wounds. He turned the screen toward Ken. "This is our internal analysis. My data team conducted it, and it tells me everything Airverse has ignored for far too long." Ken stared at the numbers, his fear growing with every passing second. 26% of discrimination complaints dismissed. Nearly 70% of black and minority passengers reporting cold treatment. Almost half of crew members having witnessed colleagues weaponize their authority. And the disciplinary rate for violations only 4%. Each number landed like a punch to Ken's chest, knocking the breath out of him. How did we let this happen?" he whispered. "Toxic culture does not appear in a single day," Jonathan replied. "It grows when people in charge forget why they started, when small mistakes are overlooked, or when small biases go uncorrected, when indifference becomes routine." Ken's arms fell at his sides. "I do not know where to begin." Jonathan looked at him with steady, unwavering eyes. Absolute transparency. Ken looked up sharply. "What did you say? You need a press conference tomorrow morning. No hiding, no dodging, no excuses. You tell the truth, the entire truth, and you present a plan to rebuild everything from the roots." Ken swallowed. "You want me to reveal all of this? It could destroy Airverse," Jonathan answered without hesitation. "Or save it." Another silence settled, but this time it did not suffocate the room. It felt like the moment when a man decides to step out of the shadows and face the light. Ken stood upright, taking a long breath. "All right, I will do it." Jonathan nodded gently, his expression softening. "Then let us begin." Over the next 3 hours, they drafted a reform plan unprecedented in Airverse's history, retraining the entire cabin crew, installing an AI monitoring system for all passenger interactions, forming an independent board to investigate cultural issues, and most importantly, creating a program called the Stand Up Initiative, proposed by Jonathan himself, designed to allow employees to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Meanwhile, at the airport, Wendy Clark sat alone in the HR room, staring at the badge that had been taken from her. She had cried until her throat burned, but the fear inside her remained untouched. 22 years of service undone by one moment of failure. The door opened. Emily Foster stepped in, her eyes red. Ross Riley followed, shoulders slumped. None of them spoke. They were no longer attendants or pilots. They were simply three people clinging to the last scraps of their dignity. Emily asked through trembling lips, "Do you think we still have a chance?" No one answered. Because their fate no longer rested in Airverse's hands. It rested in the hands of the man they had dismissed simply because he did not look like business class. The silence that filled the room was painful. At the hotel, Jonathan checked the time, 2:47 in the morning. He stepped out onto the small balcony, letting the cool wind brush against his face. He remembered Wendy's sharp sentence as she stood over him earlier. That seat is for someone more deserving. Jonathan didn't want her life to fall apart. He did not want Ross to lose everything. He did not want Emily to live under the weight of regret. But he could not shield them from the truth. Because truth is the foundation of change. Jonathan walked back inside and looked at Ken Marshall, who had fallen asleep at the table surrounded by documents. In that quiet moment, Jonathan understood something. Tomorrow would not just be a press conference. It would be the moment that determined how Airverse would survive, whether as an airline, collapsing under arrogance, or as one reborn from the ashes of its old culture. Jonathan turned off the lights, allowing the city outside to keep shining. A new chapter awaited. And he, the man once pushed out of his seat in front of everyone, was now the one writing that chapter, not with revenge, but with reform, responsibility, and faith in human dignity. The morning in New York did not truly begin with sunlight. It began with the sound of breaking news. When Jonathan opened his eyes, the hotel curtains were still drawn, but the white glow of a new day slipped through the narrow gap like an invitation. He reached for his phone. 58 unread messages, 26 missed calls, more than 300 emails, all revolving around one topic, the Airverse incident. Melissa Grant's video, not even 2 minutes long, had surpassed 1 million views in just 8 hours, becoming the centerpiece of every platform, from Twitter to major news outlets. Headlines danced across his screen like arrows piercing straight into Airverse's heart. CEO removed from business class, Airverse facing discrimination allegations. The most powerful figure in logistics, publicly humiliated. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He did not want to become the face of a media storm. He only wanted a better system. But when power collides with truth, the world never stays still. Ken Marshall had not slept at all. He arrived in the conference room downstairs at 6 in the morning, dressed in a crisp suit, but with exhaustion carved deeply into his eyes. Dozens of communications staff, legal advisors, and internal oversight officers stood around the large table, each wearing the expression of someone who felt a blade pressed against their throat. No one spoke before Ken entered, and that silence made the room feel heavy as lead. When Ken finally spoke, his voice no longer trembled, as it had the night before. It carried the hardened resolve that any CEO must possess when standing at the edge of disaster. We will not evade, we will not blame, we will not lie. A PR specialist shifted nervously. But sir, if we admit everything, we could lose billions in market value. Ken cut him off with a wave of his hand. If we keep hiding, we will lose the company. The room went silent. Jonathan reached the lobby at 8:45. As he stepped out of the elevator, he saw 3 people waiting for him. Ken Marshall, a senior communications aide, and the head of legal affairs. Ken stepped forward. "Jonathan," he said, no longer maintaining the distance of a CEO speaking to a business partner. Thank you for coming. I need you beside me at the press conference. Jonathan frowned slightly. I do not want to become the face of this event. I know, Ken replied, his eyes carrying an honesty almost impossible to refuse. But people will only trust what I say if you stand with me. Jonathan looked at him for a long moment. He understood Ken's fear. Not fear of journalists, but fear that without Jonathan's presence, the world would not believe Airverse truly intended to change. At last, Jonathan gave a single nod, a gentle nod, but firm as a vow. When the Airverse motorcade reached the company's midtown headquarters, dozens of reporters had already gathered in a semicircle, their camera flashes exploding like a storm of light. Jonathan stepped out of the car after Ken. A few reporters recognized him, and shouts erupted. Mr. Hale, do you have a statement about the AV223 incident? Are you planning to sue Airverse? Can you confirm that Airverse staff discriminated against you? Jonathan didn't respond. He simply walked past them, calm and composed, as though he had not been pushed out of a business-class seat in front of dozens of witnesses the night before. But it was precisely that calmness that made the reporters even more frantic. The Airverse press room was large, but that morning it felt smaller than usual, packed with cameras, microphones, and eyes all demanding the truth. When Ken stepped up to the podium, the noise dissolved into absolute silence. Jonathan stood beside him, saying nothing, simply existing there like a reminder that this was no ordinary press conference. Ken took a deep breath, glanced at the paper on the podium, then pushed it aside. I will speak without reading. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. He continued, I am here to accept responsibility. Not the responsibility for one individual mistake, but the responsibility for an entire system. Cameras turned toward Jonathan, but he remained still. Ken went on, his voice gaining strength with every word. Yesterday on flight, AV223. Wendy Clark, a long-serving member of our cabin crew, acted improperly toward Mr. Jonathan Hale, not only disrespectfully, not only against protocol, but in a way that reflects a part of Airverse's culture that has fractured. In the front row, a few journalists bent over their laptops, fingers flying across the keys. Ken spoke further than any PR team had ever intended. I have no excuse to offer, and I will not attempt to use any. A reporter raised his hand. Mr. Marshall, can you prove that Airverse is not racist? Ken looked straight at him. No, not today. But starting tomorrow, we will. The room rippled with whispers. Then Ken delivered the line that made the entire press room hold its breath. And to accomplish that, I need the cooperation of the man who forced us to face the truth. He turned to Jonathan. Mr. Hale, please. Jonathan stepped forward. No one in the room knew what he would say. No one knew if he would condemn Airverse. No one knew whether the careers of last night's crew would survive. Jonathan looked out at hundreds of eyes and spoke slowly. I did not intend to appear today. I did not want to become the center of this story. I do not want anyone losing their job because of me. He paused, then looked straight into the cameras. But I want a safer and more equitable aviation industry. A reporter called out, Are you angry? Jonathan met her gaze. If I express anger, people will say I overreacted. If I stay silent, people will say I accepted poor treatment. I choose neither. I choose action. The press room fell quiet enough to hear the clicks of cameras. Jonathan continued. Today Airverse committed to change, and I will personally oversee that change, That single sentence, sharp and clear, made not only Ken, but the entire world pause. When the press conference ended, the two men stepped off the stage amid a flurry of questions and flashes. But as they entered the hallway behind the podium, no microphones remained. No cameras followed. Only two men who had endured one of the longest nights of their lives. Ken exhaled deeply and said, "Thank you." Jonathan shook his head. "Do not thank me. Thank me when Airverse truly changes." Across the city, Wendy Clark sat before her television in her small suburban apartment. She watched Jonathan standing beside Ken, calm, steady, never once uttering a harsh word toward her or Captain Ross. She burst into tears not out of fear of losing her job, but because she finally understood that the man she had dismissed carelessly was someone the entire industry would have to bow to. Yet he did not wish to crush her. When she turned off the TV and saw her reflection in the dark screen, Wendy felt ashamed for the first time in years. Not because she had been caught, but because she realized she had lost her kindness somewhere along the way. Meanwhile, Emily visited Captain Ross, who sat silently in his small living room with his hands clasped tightly. Emily sat beside him. "I think they might give us a chance," she whispered. "Mr. Hale is not someone who wants to destroy people." Ross looked at her, then at the TV replaying the press conference. His gaze softened slightly, though worry remained. "No one knows," he said quietly. "But I hope so." As for Jonathan leaving Airverse headquarters, he stepped into the New York streets, where the first sunlight slid across the rain-washed pavement. He lifted his eyes toward the pale gray sky. A new day was beginning, and he knew this was not the end of last night's incident, but the beginning of a long, turbulent process. But he was ready, because from the moment he had been pushed out of that business-class seat, he understood something clearly. Sometimes fate chooses one person to ignite the change a broken system has forgotten it needs. And today, that person was him. The morning after the press conference, New York was no longer just a city beginning another ordinary day. The media erupted, as if a spark had landed on a barrel of gunpowder. From Times Square to the subway stations, LED screens flashed non-stop with headlines: Airverse faces severe crisis. Jonathan Hale to oversee restructuring. Cultural reform in aviation begins with the AV223 incident. The crowd still rushed along the sidewalks, but the air felt heavier, denser, as if the entire city had been pulled into the center of a societal storm. Jonathan stepped out of the hotel, his dark coat fluttering in the early cold wind. Reporters still waited outside, but this time they did not swarm him like the day before. They simply watched, raising cameras and taking notes, as if they were witnessing the emergence of a symbol of change that no one dared approach too closely. Jonathan did not want to be the center of attention, but he understood there were moments when silence becomes the anchor that allows other voices to rise. And right now, the world needed those voices. In the black SUV taking him to the temporary reform headquarters, Jonathan scrolled through hundreds of articles. But what held his thoughts most was not the market analysis, but the video of Ken Marshall's apology. A CEO rarely reveals vulnerability before the entire world. But Ken had done exactly that, and that honesty convinced Jonathan that Ken was not merely trying to save face. He truly wanted change. The car stopped outside Meridian Dynamics, the temporary coordination center, where the joint reform team of both companies would work. Jonathan entered the large conference room where nearly 20 experts were already waiting. On the screen hung a chart showing Air Verse's stock plunging. Yet no one panicked. They looked at Jonathan the way sailors look at a new magnetic north for a sinking ship. Jonathan stopped, set his laptop on the table, and said, his voice resonating through the room, "Today we are not fixing a mistake. We are fixing a culture." The room fell silent, not out of fear, but because they knew he was right. While Jonathan began presenting the plan, the story was shifting elsewhere, where those who had erred were facing the true consequences of the crisis. In the suburbs of New York, Wendy Clark woke with the feeling that her heart had fallen to the bottom of her chest. Her small apartment suddenly felt far too large, though it had only 2 rooms. She looked at the clock, not even 8. But her phone already showed 15 messages from friends, former co-workers, and 4 missed calls from family. She did not dare turn on the TV, but the sound echoing from her neighbor's unit was enough to tell her that her name was on every headline. She sat on her bed, her hands trembling. She was not a bad person. At least she had always believed she wasn't. She had once been a good attendant, helping elderly passengers carrying sick children when their parents panicked. But years of exhaustion, pressure, entitlement from wealthy travelers, constant evaluations, and countless disrespectful encounters had built up a rough layer of armor. She had lost patience. She had lost kindness. She began using her small authority like a club to protect a pride worn thin by years of strain. And in the end, she lost herself. In the bathroom mirror, Wendy saw a woman with reddened eyes, messy hair, and a face caught between arrogance and collapse. She whispered, barely audible, "What have I done?" Across the city, Captain Ross. Riley faced the hardest morning of his life. He sat in the living room with a cold cup of coffee and the suspension notice lying neatly on the table. He had not told his wife. She was still upstairs preparing for a family lunch. Ross knew that once she saw the falling stock chart and the messages from colleagues, she would realize something terrible had happened. Ross had always been a serious man. For 27 years of flying, he viewed himself as a symbol of discipline and correctness. But he had also absorbed aviation's unwritten culture. The culture of truth comes second to being on schedule. Yesterday, when he stood before Jonathan and insisted he move seats to avoid delay, he genuinely didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He believed he was handling the situation quickly and efficiently. But today, looking back, he understood the cost of that complacency was far too high. Emily Foster, the only one of the 3 who still carried clear, earnest eyes, felt the deepest ache. She never wanted Wendy fired. She never wanted Ross suspended. But she knew that without last night's incident, she too might have become like Wendy, worn down, hardened, and one day judging an innocent passenger unfairly. Emily sat in the kitchen, holding a warm cup of tea, as if clinging to her last breath of stability. She replayed the press conference and watched Jonathan silently. He had not publicly condemned Wendy, not mentioned Ross by name, not humiliated Air Verse. He spoke only of human dignity. Emily burst into tears. All 3 of them had been wrong, but the man they wronged had refused to destroy them. That made her regret even more than the fear of losing her job. In Manhattan, inside Meridian's meeting room, Jonathan reviewed the behavioral analysis reports. When passengers lose trust, the communications expert said the brand loses their hearts. Jonathan nodded. "Then we will rebuild that heart," he replied. When the meeting ended, Ken Marshall walked in with a newspaper in hand. He handed it to Jonathan. On the front page was a photo of the two of them standing side by side. The night that shook the aviation industry. Jonathan read it, folded it, and set it down. "Ken," he said quietly, "this is only the first wave. The bigger ones are still coming." Ken sighed. "I know. But at least now I have you." Jonathan shook his head. "No, Ken. You have Airverse itself if you learn how to make your people feel valued." Meanwhile, in the Airverse HR office, a final decision was being drafted. The disciplinary council did not want to act out of panic. They did not want to punish the 3 employees because of public pressure. They wanted to reflect the spirit that Ken and Jonathan were trying to build, not cutting off heads, but healing the roots. Wendy stood outside the hallway, clutching her hand so tightly that her nails pressed into her palms. Emily walked beside her, trying to stay calm, though her heart raced. Ross followed behind his once imposing frame, now diminished like a man awaiting judgment. When the door opened, they entered. Before them sat a long table, 7 supervisors watching them, not with condemnation, but with the gaze of people trying to balance justice with mercy. The decision was delivered in a steady voice. "Your actions were wrong, but we seek change, not destruction. Wendy Clark, 3-month suspension with mandatory retraining. Emily Foster, noted for failure to intervene, but not terminated. Ross Riley, 6-month suspension with re-evaluation for reinstatement." The 3 looked at one another. No one spoke, but in the silence, there was something that resembled hope. In Midtown, Jonathan stood on the rooftop of Meridian, watching Airverse planes take off in the distance. He knew the journey ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But he felt his heart grow lighter, because at least he had done what was right, and the world even slowly was shifting in the direction he had hoped for. He slid his hands into his coat pockets, closed his eyes, and let the morning breeze run through his hair. One chapter had closed. A new one had opened. And he, the man pushed from his seat just 1 day earlier, was now rewriting how an entire industry treated human beings. In the days following the press conference, America spoke of nothing but Airverse. The AV223 incident had moved far beyond the boundaries of a single airline. It had become the symbol of something much larger, a problem people had avoided, buried, or accepted as an unfortunate normal in the service industry. But this time, someone refused to accept it. And because of that, the entire system was forced to stop. Jonathan Hale, despite trying to stay away from attention, could not escape the tidal wave of coverage. The media called him the man who made the aviation industry face itself. Market analysts called him the quiet detonator, a man who never raised his voice, yet possessed the power to shake every layer of a system. As for Airverse, they had no path backward. The explosive press conference sent their stock down 8% in a single day. And although that was bad news, it opened the door to something many within the company had quietly hoped for: real reform. Jonathan watched everything from a distance, not with pride, but with caution. He understood that every step Airverse took now was like walking on thin ice. The right direction could lead to rebirth, the wrong one could sink them. What he did not expect was how this crisis would trigger a chain reaction. That very night, 6 other major airlines released statements. No one wanted to be the next one. Delta Aeromax, Skyjet, Continental Nova Wings all announced they were reviewing internal procedures. But Jonathan understood what those words really meant: fear and opportunity. Fear because they knew they might meet another Jonathan. And opportunity because change was no longer avoidable. In a closed-door meeting, Ken Marshall showed Jonathan dozens of emails sent by senior pilots and flight attendants. We've seen this happen many times. Thank you for speaking up. If Mr. Hale needs testimony, I will step forward. Jonathan read each line with a heavy heart. He realized Wendy and Ross were not the only victims of a distorted culture, they were its products. What troubled him was not that he had been pushed out of his seat, but the realization that there were hundreds of Wendys and hundreds of Rosses repeating the same mistakes with no one telling them to stop. Meanwhile, in suburban New York, Wendy Clark stepped outside for the first time after days of only daring to watch the world through the slit of her door. She went to the neighborhood grocery store to buy food. But the moment she walked through the automatic doors, two shoppers recognized her from the news and whispered. Wendy bit her lip, lowered her head, trying to stay steady under the weight of guilt crashing over her. Suddenly, someone touched her shoulder. Wendy flinched and turned around. It was an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. "I watched the press conference," the woman said softly. "Not everyone is brave enough to face their mistakes. You didn't run from it. That is something worthy." Wendy froze. She had expected judgment from the world, but she had not expected forgiveness to come first. She broke down in tears in the middle of the aisle. The woman said nothing more, simply placed a comforting hand on Wendy's shoulder before walking away. That small moment cracked open the shell of arrogance Wendy had worn over her heart for years. At the same time, Captain Ross Riley sat in the dining room, where his wife placed a fresh cup of coffee before him. "You can make this right," she said, holding his hand. Ross was not accustomed to hearing such words. He was used to being strong, to bracing himself against any storm. But this time, he lowered his head in silence. The only words he managed to whisper were, "I forgot why I started flying." His wife touched his cheek and murmured, "Then find it again." While Wendy and Ross faced their painful rebirth, something else was unfolding a few blocks away. Jonathan received a call from the chairman of the National Aviation Federation. "We would like you to speak at next week's annual conference," the man said, his voice slightly trembling. "The industry needs to hear you." Jonathan was silent for a few seconds before replying, "I do not want to be the face of a crisis. I just want this industry to treat people as human beings." The voice on the other end exhaled. "That is exactly why we need you." Jonathan ended the call and looked out the window. Tiny planes crossed the night sky. He thought about the thousands of people on every flight, about the countless passengers who had been dismissed, ignored, or humiliated because of the unconscious bias of someone with a small measure of authority. He could not fix everything, but he could start something. The very next day, Jonathan and Ken announced Airverse's reform plan based on 3 pillars: transparency, accountability, and humanity. Every passenger complaint would be addressed within 5 days. Every frontline employee would be retrained. Every incident with signs of discrimination would be investigated by an independent board. And most notably, Airverse would establish a fund called the Human First Initiative, an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars to protect passenger dignity and support employees who stood up for what was right. When the article about the Human First Initiative was published, social media exploded. Many called it the most significant cultural revolution in aviation in 30 years. But what surprised Jonathan most was a message from Emily. "Mr. Hale, I will join the employee retraining team. I want to be part of the change." Jonathan stared at the message for a long time, feeling something soften inside him. a small light but a real one. That afternoon, another unexpected message arrived from Wendy Clark. "I do not dare ask for forgiveness," it read, "but I want to thank you. Because of you, I saw the person I lost. If I have a chance, I want to make it right." Jonathan reread it multiple times, not because he was shocked, but because he understood that sincere regret is the first step toward rebirth. As night fell, Ken called Jonathan up to the Airverse rooftop. The evening wind was strong, sweeping away the tension of the long day. Ken stood gazing toward the distant airport, where Airverse planes still took off, even if a bit unsteadily. "Do you see it?" Ken said quietly. "We did not collapse," Jonathan replied, "because you chose to face it." Ken turned toward him, sincerity in his eyes. "And because you forced me to." A plane ascended into the night sky, its blinking lights cutting through the darkness. Jonathan watched it, feeling a weight lift from within. It was not just a plane. It was a symbol of a system renegotiating with itself about dignity, responsibility, and humanity. Jonathan took a deep breath, and for the first time since boarding that flight, he felt what he had been searching for over the years, a sense of hope. Not hope in an airline, but hope in the human capacity to change. Tomorrow carried more challenges, but today at least the world had moved in the right direction. Jonathan looked up at the sky once more and whispered a quiet reminder to himself. This is only the beginning. 7 days after the biggest media storm Airverse had ever faced, New York seemed normal again. But for those who had lived inside that storm, normal no longer felt familiar. Jonathan Hale stepped out of the Meridian building in the late afternoon, the sunset reflecting off the glass towers and casting a rare, warm, orange glow across the winter air. He had just finished the final meeting with the reform team before Airverse announced its new system-wide policies the next morning. A new chapter for the aviation industry was about to be written, and Jonathan knew he had reached the end of a journey he never intended to begin. He entered the waiting SUV and settled into the back seat. Outside, people rushed past, each absorbed in their own lives. No one knew that the man sitting quietly inside the dark vehicle had helped shift the course of an entire system. But Jonathan did not need anyone to know. He only needed the world to be a little better than it had been a week earlier. The car moved along Fifth Avenue, where the billboards had already begun replacing news about the AV223 incident with new topics. But on social media, the story continued to spread, no longer a scandal, but a widespread conversation about dignity, fairness, and the way people treat one another. A new hashtag emerged, Human First Now, and Jonathan knew it was not the work of any PR campaign. It was the voice of the community of ordinary people who had witnessed the truth and wanted to preserve what was right. When the car reached Bryant Park, Jonathan asked the driver to stop. He stepped out and walked along the leaf-covered path. For the first time in a week of chaos, he had a moment to breathe deeply and let a subtle sense of relief settle into his chest. This ordeal had taken much from him, time, energy, patience. But it had also given him things he never expected: the respect of an entire industry, the hope of thousands of employees, and most importantly, a reminder of the responsibility that comes with kindness. As he walked, a voice called out from a nearby bench. "Mr. Hale," he toned. It was Emily Foster. She wore a thick coat and a scarf, and in the soft glow of sunset, she looked both nervous and determined. Jonathan approached. "Emily," he greeted her gently. "How are you holding up?" Emily gave a small smile, more genuine than anything he had seen from her on that flight. "I am trying," she said. "Since that day, I have been reading a lot, thinking a lot. And I wanted to thank you." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Thank me," Emily nodded, her voice trembling, yet firm. "For not destroying us publicly. For letting Airverse handle this the right way. Not with anger. People say you're powerful because of your influence. But I think your real strength is that you chose not to use it for revenge." Jonathan stayed silent for a moment. He looked at the young woman before him, a flight attendant who had stood in the middle of the conflict, made mistakes, but had a heart willing to grow. "Emily," he said softly, "people are not judged by how they fall, but by how they rise. I never wanted you or Ross or Wendy to be ruined. I just wanted everyone to remember that power does not lie in the seat you sit in, but in how you treat others." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I will remember that," she said, then hesitated before continuing. "And I will be joining the new training program. If you allow it, I want to teach. I want to share my story, so younger attendants do not repeat my mistakes." Jonathan smiled, a genuine smile, warm and rare. "I would be glad if you did." Emily bowed her head gratefully, then walked away. Jonathan watched her go, feeling as if he had witnessed a door opening, not for Airverse, but for Emily herself. When Jonathan returned to the car, his phone vibrated. A message from Ken Marshall. "I want you to review the final version of the policy before we announce it, and I hope you will be there tomorrow." Not as a victim, as the co-founder of the Human First program. Jonathan read the message, then gazed out the window at the rising city lights. He knew Ken was not exaggerating. Jonathan had not wanted to stand at the center of anything. But sometimes, for true change to occur, a person has to stand exactly where fate places them. The next morning, Airverse headquarters carried a strange, heavy quiet, the kind that arrives right before a major shift. In the large auditorium, more than 300 employees filled the seats while millions watched the live stream around the world. When Jonathan entered with Ken, every pair of eyes turned toward them, not with curiosity, but with expectation. Ken opened the announcement with a short speech, then turned to Jonathan. "No one deserves to speak about Human First more than him," Ken said. Jonathan stepped to the podium, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes. He inhaled without notes, without a script, letting his heart guide his words. This past week, he began, we did not just witness an incident. We witnessed a reminder that sometimes what makes us fall are not the storms, but the small things we overlook. The room went completely silent. But people have a remarkable ability, the ability to change. And today Airverse is not just changing procedures. Airverse is changing the way it sees people. Jonathan spoke about Wendy, about Ross, about Emily not naming them to protect their privacy, but sharing the lessons so everyone understood that a mistake does not define a person. He spoke of passengers who had been mistreated, of employees who had lost their kindness under pressure. And he ended with a line that made the entire auditorium rise in applause. "We cannot rewrite the flight of that day, but we can rewrite the sky of tomorrow." The announcement did more than spread. It became the most inspiring video of the week. Other airlines reached out to Jonathan and Ken to learn from the Human First model. Universities added the AV223 incident to their curriculum on organizational culture, and even critics of Airverse had to admit the company was leading a true transformation. That night, Jonathan returned home after 10 days without a full night's sleep. He opened the door, removed his coat, and sank into the sofa. For the first time in many days, there were no messages, no urgent calls, no crisis reports, only quiet. He looked out the window, just as a plane crossed the night sky, its lights blinking softly. He smiled. 1 week ago, he had been forced out of his seat on a flight. Today, he had helped an entire industry rethink how it treated human beings. This was not a victory of power. It was a victory of dignity. Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the silence embrace him. His flight was complete, and the sky once again was wide open. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and human behavior, the journey of Jonathan Hale reveals a truth that many systems of power often choose to ignore, that the greatest failures do not begin with catastrophic decisions, but with small moments that are quietly dismissed. A condescending glance, a rule that is conveniently overlooked, a passenger treated like a burden, each is a signal of a culture drifting away from the values it proudly claims to uphold. Yet what gives this story its true weight more than the incident itself, more than the shock waves that followed, is the way one individual chose to respond when he was underestimated. Jonathan did not retaliate with anger. He used composure as leverage strategy as his tool, and dignity as his foundation. When power is used to build rather than to punish, the result is not merely an apology. It is the awakening of an entire system. And that is the greatest lesson this story offers, that real strength does not lie in shouting, but in the ability to make the world stop and listen when you speak with clarity and dignity. If this story resonates with you, please like the video to help spread these meaningful values, and subscribe to continue accompanying us on future journeys, stories where kindness, courage, and truth always find their way. And do not forget to comment with the phrase "Ju Pham Jia," a reminder that at any altitude from ground level to 30,000 feet, every human being deserves to be treated with respect,